Turning 18 is supposed to be a milestone, one filled with celebration, cake, and maybe a few sentimental tears. But for me, my parents had a different kind of gift in mind. No party. No heartfelt congratulations. Just a cold, matter-of-fact conversation, start paying rent, or find somewhere else to live. I sat there, stunned. Rent? Where had this even come from? They had never once hinted at it before. My parents and I had a distant relationship, if you could even call it that. They provided the basics, food, shelter, clothes, but warmth? Affection? That was never part of the deal. Conversations in our house were minimal, interactions strictly transactional. I wasn't sure if they ever truly saw me as their child or just an obligation they had to fund until I turned legal. And funding me, they could afford. My mother, an English teacher, and my father, a marketing professional, lived comfortably. Yet I always sensed they resented any dollar spent on me, like I was a monthly bill they couldn't wait to cancel. That's why, just to be safe, I had gotten a job in high school, a modest intern position at an office supply store. The pay wasn't much, but it gave me a sense of security, a buffer in case I ever needed it. Though, until that moment, I never imagined I actually would. Yet there I was, being told I had to either hand over money or leave. The sheer calculation of it burned. They had been waiting, just waiting, for the day I turned legal so they could shove me out the door. If that was how they felt, I wasn't about to stick around and beg for scraps of kindness. So, I left. I packed what I could, grabbed my essentials, and stormed out, fueled by anger and betrayal. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me struggle to make a decision. If they wanted me gone so badly, I'd do them the favor. I spent that first night at a friend's house, and when my parents didn't even try to stop me or check in, I knew this wasn't a bluff on their part. They had meant every word. It still blindsided me, though. They had always been indifferent, but never outright cruel. Never this eager to be rid of me. Thankfully, I had options. College was set to begin in the fall, and my maternal grandparents had a dedicated fund for my tuition, one my parents couldn't touch. My father's parents had passed away when he was young, so it was my mom's side of the family that had always been my safety net. Still, I wasn't prepared to be on my own just yet. The money I'd saved could cover rent for a short time, but what about everything else? Utilities, food, emergencies, I hadn't accounted for those. And yet, despite knowing all this, I refused to turn back. For days later, my phone rang. It was my grandparents. They had no clue what had happened. When I arrived at their house, I laid everything out, the ultimatum, the way my parents had treated me, the way I felt like nothing more than a financial burden to them. My grandparents were furious. They had always known my parents weren't the warmest people, but this crossed a line they hadn't expected. They told me, immediately, that I should move in with them. It wasn't the first time they'd offered, but once again, I declined. Not because I didn't love them, but because I did. My grandfather ran a successful furniture business, so money wasn't the issue, but his health was declining. Parkinson's had taken hold, and my grandmother already had enough to handle. The last thing I wanted was to add my problems to their plate. I reassured them that I would be okay, that I'd figure things out on my own. They were disappointed but understood. And at the very least, I had the comfort of knowing that if I ever did need help, they were there for me. That alone meant more than I could put into words. After that, I got to work. Apartment hunting, job searching, doing everything I could to get my life in order before college. My weekly visits to my grandparents became my one source of stability in the chaos. Then, yesterday, my phone rang again. This time, it was my father's business number, the only one I had forgotten to block. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. When I picked up, both my parents were on the line. Their voices were tense. Urgent. Not with concern for me, of course, but for themselves. They had just learned that my grandfather had pulled out of an investment, a deal my mother had barely convinced him to support. My father had been planning to launch a business in a few months, and this investment was crucial. And now? It was gone. My grandfather had withdrawn the moment he learned what they'd done to me. That was why they were calling. Not to apologize. Not to check on me. No, they wanted me to fix it. To convince my grandfather to change his mind. I laughed. I actually laughed. The same people who had kicked me out without hesitation now expected me to come running to bail them out? I told them no. Flat out. They had made their choice. They had treated me like an afterthought, a nuisance, a walking expense, and now, suddenly, I was important. Now they needed me? They had dug their own grave. I wasn't about to hand them a ladder. I was about to hang up when my mother's voice cut through, sharp with accusation. She called me selfish. Ungrateful. She reminded me that they had paid for everything my entire life, and now, when I had a little money of my own, I was abandoning them. And that's when it hit me. They had never expected me to leave. They had assumed I'd grumble, complain, maybe argue, but in the end, they thought I'd stay. Pay up. Keep being their backup plan. They had underestimated me. I let my mother's words hang in the air, heavy with bitterness. Then, without another thought, I hung up. They didn't even get to tell me how much rent they had planned to charge. Because it didn't matter. I was never coming back. In a fury-fueled exit, my mother nearly dissolved into tears as she confessed that although they weren't perfect parents, her love for me was genuine, and my wild outburst made her wonder if they'd gravely misstepped. My father told me it was entirely my decision, but he firmly reminded me that the business he was about to launch was not just any venture, it was his dream project and the cornerstone of his aspirations, and he would be utterly devastated if it didn't succeed, all because they had asked me to pay rent, a request that countless parents across the country impose without serious consequences. They instructed me to reflect and respond within a week, and now I'm left feeling like an awful person, utterly confused about how I could be labeled the villain for leaving when my parents forced me into an ultimatum: pay rent or hit the road. Update 1. So, after much thought, I've decided that I won't return to grovel or apologize to my parents as I once planned. My uncontrolled emotions simply overwhelmed me that day. Now, with a clearer head and after reading numerous thoughtful responses on my post, I firmly believe that I owe them absolutely nothing by reaching out to apologize or to reconcile with my grandparents in order to set everything right. I still have 2 days left to inform them of my decision, yet my mind is already firmly set, and I'm fully aware that they will hardly welcome this news with any warmth or understanding. My mother was visibly emotional, though in hindsight, those tears might have been entirely contrived. I never truly saw them glisten, so who can be absolutely sure if she was genuinely weeping or merely performing to evoke my pity? It might sound remarkably naive, but honestly, I don't trust my parents in the slightest, especially when they've done absolutely nothing to mend the broken past. I haven't spoken to my grandparents about this situation, as I wish to avoid appearing overly entangled in matters that, frankly, don't directly concern me. However, I have discussed the entire ordeal with several close friends, and they unanimously believe that what I'm doing is completely justified. After all, my parents were the ones who ignited this entire conflict, so they cannot simply shift the blame onto me and expect my acquiescence. They must take full accountability for all of their actions. Update 2. Alright, I must inform my parents of my decision tomorrow, and today I chose to speak candidly with my grandparents about the matter. I realize I previously claimed to feel confident about my choice in the last update, yet now my conscience weighs heavily. I simply cannot proceed without experiencing the pangs of guilt for crushing my father's dreams. It does sound dramatically overblown, I know, but that was exactly how he described it. I remain uncertain whether his tone was theatrical or if he truly believes that his new business depends on my compliance. When I recounted the contentious phone call with my parents to my grandparents, they firmly assured me that I had absolutely no cause for worry or guilt. They explained in detail that once they learned about the harsh ultimatum, they had already resolved to withdraw completely from the deal, and nothing, no matter what, would alter that decision. It wasn't solely about me, several additional factors had compelled them to step down as investors. They even confessed that they had never fully trusted my father, having only joined the venture reluctantly at my mother's insistence, and now that trust has been irrevocably shattered, for one simply cannot build a business without a rock-solid foundation of trust. That shocking revelation eased my crushing guilt considerably, because no matter what, I couldn't have possibly persuaded my beloved grandparents to rejoin the ill-fated deal, so in truth, the full responsibility lies entirely with them. Update 3. Today, I informed my parents of my decision, though I still wonder why I ever expected them to respond with any semblance of reason. I chose to deliver the news over the phone, deliberately avoiding any further drama that might erupt from appearing at their doorstep. When I called, my mother answered with an unexpectedly excited tone, which made me wary of giving her false hope. Cutting straight to the chase, I told her plainly that I had firmly resolved not to contact my grandparents, nor would I attempt to convince them to come back on board with anything. I then laid out my reasons in full, ensuring they were completely aware of the unvarnished truth so they couldn't delude themselves into thinking they bore no blame for the current chaos. I reminded them that there were countless alternative approaches they could have taken to resolve matters without demeaning me for my refusal to pay rent. I explained that the very reason I began working at 16 was directly due to their ongoing neglect. I never felt secure enough to rely on or place my trust in them. Deep inside, I knew that eventually they would force me out of their home, which is why I started working tirelessly and saving every penny possible to leave at the earliest opportunity. They hadn't even bothered to consider the future, college expenses, tuition fees, or any funds set aside for my education. I'm not saying they were legally obligated, but as my parents, they had both the capacity and the means to support me. All of my friends had the luxury of their parents covering their tuition, while I remained the only one forced to rely on my grandparents for financial support. Over the years, they never once made me feel that I could count on them, whether in matters of money or even in terms of emotional support. Moreover, to be fair, they had even given me the option to move out voluntarily, so I simply accepted their offer without protest. I never felt it was my responsibility to act as an intermediary and clear the air with my grandparents. Why should it be my burden if my father's dream of launching a successful business falls apart simply because they demanded rent from the very money I was diligently saving for my future? After I finished my tirade, my dad declared that I was a monumental disappointment and expressed regret for even engaging with me, as he had hoped I would behave reasonably. He admitted, with a heavy heart, that he felt like a failure for having raised an egotistical, self-centered brat as his son. Nothing could inflict him more shame than the way I acted. Perhaps I shouldn't have pushed so far, but I escalated the confrontation by telling him bluntly that he need not feel shame because, in truth, he had never really raised me at all, leaving him without responsibility for my state. That remark struck a nerve, setting him off completely, so I put him on speakerphone while I continued breakfast, even as he erupted in a tirade of shouts. My mother tried desperately to calm him down. For a brief moment, the absurdity was almost entertaining, until he began accusing me of exploiting them for money over the years. I still cannot comprehend what that accusation meant, given that I was merely a child and, as my parents, they were legally obligated to provide for me. It wasn't as if they were doing me favors by letting me live in their home and feeding me. Instead, their neglect was evident in every aspect of my upbringing, and that painful reality still haunts me. They would have dismissed me not only emotionally but financially too, if not for the law that forced them to acknowledge my existence and leave me to fend for myself. I explained to my father that I hadn't been exploiting him for cash, since until just days ago, I was still a legal minor, obliging him to cover my well-being within his means. Even then, I always strove to rely on my own savings for necessities, even if it was something as trivial as a pair of sneakers. Ever since I started working at the store, I've been paying my own way and keeping a low profile so as not to burden my parents, yet even that self-reliance never seemed to satisfy them. They always demanded more and more. This escalating pressure exploded into a brutal argument, with both my father and mother hurling cutting insults. By the time I ended the call, I was emotionally shattered and at a loss for how to cope alone. I didn't want to disturb my friend, who already labored late into the night and slept in, generously letting me stay with him rent-free, so I resolved not to add my woes to his burdens. Instead, I reached out to the one people I knew I could always depend on, my grandparents. They answered almost immediately. I broke down in tears as I recounted the painful conversation with my parents. My grandparents, clearly upset by their harsh words, promised they would set things right. I couldn't fully grasp what they meant, and I hesitated to ask further, trusting that whatever they did would ultimately be for the best. Naturally, they knew better than to try and reconcile me with my parents, so they never promised a reunion. Although they haven't revealed their exact plan, their steely tone made it clear that nothing pleasant was in store for my parents. They were ready to come down hard. And, oddly, I felt a spark of anticipation about what was to come. Update 4. 2 days ago, I confided in my grandparents about the horrendous phone call with my parents, and they assured me they'd fix the situation. If you recall, today they finally did, and honestly, I didn't see it coming. They posted a scathing message on social media, detailing how my parents had siphoned money from them for years just to put food on the table when I was a child, and yet repaid that kindness with ingratitude, treating me like an unbearable burden, something their own parents never did. Apparently, even the house they lived in belonged to a friend of my grandparents, who had allowed them to rent at a reduced rate thanks to my grandpa. This meant they had absolutely no right to accuse me of money grubbing when, in fact, they had exploited my grandparents in the same way when I was just a kid. After all, I was still a child, they were fully grown, even with a child of their own, and yet couldn't scrape by on their own. Moreover, I discovered that my parents had used me as an excuse to borrow outrageous sums from my grandparents ever since I was an infant. Despite knowing they were being fleeced, my grandparents continued giving because they truly cared for their daughter. Today, they were heartbroken to learn that my mother couldn't even extend the same care to her own son, seeming to value her husband above me. They declared that my father had been a complete fool since my childhood, a sentiment that had already made them reluctant to invest in his business ventures. He tried to start 2 businesses when I was young, both of which failed, forcing my grandparents to rescue him and settle his debts. They refused to endure that cycle again, which clearly explains their hesitance to invest in my parents' business, and honestly, it's entirely fair. Their post quickly drew widespread attention from our relatives and friends, and I'm considering sharing it further so more people can see how appalling my parents are. So far, I haven't heard a word from them. I suspect they've seen the post but can't muster a fitting response since every word rings true. I wager they now regret their heartlessness on that call. If only they had let me leave without the confrontation, they wouldn't be entangled in such a mess. Update 5. It's been a week since my grandparents' post, and nearly the entire family has severed ties with my parents. Later that evening, my grandparents told me that after my mother showed up with my father at their house, a huge fight erupted as my parents demanded the post be taken down. Yet my grandparents remained unfazed, standing firm because they believed they were justified in provoking such a confrontation. Clearly, my parents unleashed a torrent of insults and curses at them, but my grandparents absorbed it with grim resolve, fully expecting such behavior from people like them. They've been relentlessly pressuring to have the post removed, even filing a defamation lawsuit against my grandpa, claiming that the viral post is costing them business. I can scarcely fathom how my parents twist every situation to shift blame onto others rather than accepting responsibility, as if they're incapable of admitting their mistakes and apologizing. They haven't reached out to me at all, which I take as a good omen that they've finally stopped pestering me. I also confided in a friend, as I had recently discovered an affordable apartment to share with 2 roommates. Yet when I mentioned my plans to move out, he surprised me by offering me a place with him for as long as I needed. Apparently, he had read my post and firmly believed I should be saving money for the future, knowing full well that my parents would never change and would always try to drag me down. He's a few years my senior, already working for nearly a year, and still receiving occasional allowances from his own parents, so he could easily afford to let me stay with him for now. I'm profoundly grateful for such a friend, as people like him are exceedingly rare in today's ruthless world. I suppose I was truly lucky in the department of having both wonderful grandparents and steadfast friends.